Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the fifth in our series of Giller monthly master panels. Tonight's conversation will focus on Indigenous Canadian writers as they explore identity through their art. For those of us in Toronto, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our host tonight is the one and the only Duncan McCue, a multi-award-winning journalist. McCue is the host of CBC Radio 1's Cross Country Checkup. A reporter for CBC News in Vancouver for over 15 years, McCue is now based in Toronto. His news and current affairs pieces continued to be featured on CBC's flagship news show, The National. Right now, McCue is currently away from Cross Country Checkup on a Massey College Journalism Fellowship. Duncan McCue will introduce our panelists for tonight's events, and please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit all of your questions. They'll be put to the panel in the last 15 minutes of our broadcast. I'm as eager as you are to get to it, so without further ado, please welcome Duncan McCue.
Miigwech, Daphna, Anin Kinawea, Bindigan, Giller Master Panel. Hi everyone, welcome to the Giller Master Panel. Onkwadons Indigenous Cas, Minwa, Jagan Ashwan in the nose when Duncan McCue. Maingan Nedodem, Chippewas, Georgina Island, and Donjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao, and Gichinandam, Wabum in the Cook, Nongo Dibikak. It's good to see you all. Although we can't see you, it's good to see everyone here on the screen with us and joining us for this super exciting panel with some amazing authors. So without further ado, I don't want to be here on the screen by myself. So I'm going to call for all of our authors to join us here as I introduce them. So if you can pop on screen with me, that would be outstanding. And I think they're out there somewhere. There we go. There's Mr. Waubgeshig Rice, Katherena Vermette, Cherie Dimaline, and Drew Taylor is joining us with his Res Internet, and they really don't need, I mean, these are all such famous Indigenous authors that I really don't need to go on extensively about their introductions, but I will say that Katherena is Red River Métis, Cherie is Georgian Bay Métis, Waubgeshig Rice is Anishinaabe from Wasauksing, and Drew Taylor is Anishinaabe from Curve Lake, and Ani, hello, my friends. Good to see you all.
Ani, bonjour.
Happy Indigenous Peoples Day to you all.
And to you.
I want to. So the panel is called Indigenous Authors Explore Identity Through Language, and we'll get it. We're going to get into all kinds of different questions, and I'm talking about your writing and your work and how you've created the amazing works that you've done. But it is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and I've got a really key question that I want to start off just asking everybody: fry bread or bannock? What's your preference? It's a really important question. Drew, can I start with you?
In my community, we actually call it soskan, but a fried bread by any other name is still tasty.
Fry bread, okay. So Drew's, I'm gonna go out to the west now. Katherena, what about you? Fry bread or bannock?
I have to go with fry bread, or as my mère used to call it, pancrouche, which is just like deep fried, and it had to be in beef fat. Yeah.
Nice.
But pure fry bread, pure fry bread.
I think Waubgeshig and I have the same name for it. Fry bread or bannock?
We call it scone here.
Scone, yeah.
And Cherie, what about you?
Bannock. I'm supposed to say bannock, though there is like a caveat, which is that bannock with raisins in it just needs to not exist. I don't know how that's even a thing.
You didn't go there. So Cherie just opened up the raisin debate. I don't know about raisins in the fry bread. Drew?
No, that's an unfamiliar topic around here. Taking that thought and running with it, I'm pro raisin in butter tarts, even though I know people are anti-raisin and they're wrong.
Yeah, Katherena, raisins is that?
No, No, raisins are like bugs in food.
Yes.
Like, I don't know why we do that to anyone. That's mean.
I don't have, Bob, what do you have? Do you have raisin feelings about with your scone?
No raisins, but blueberries all the way.
Oh, that's nice.
Okay.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Good. So these are important questions, and I know that the audience wanted to know all those. And of course, if you have questions of yourself, people that are joining us to watch, do put them in the Q&A, and it'll be a bit like cross-country checkup. I'll try to start throwing them in toward the end of the show, and we'll get to your important questions like how could you put raisins in a good piece of chunk of bannock, Cherie? I just don't understand.
I don't, it's horrible. I've just been served it before. I left. I walked out of the house and I was served, but yeah.
I have one. Before I get into your books, I just have one more question, because it is the solstice, an important day for so many of our peoples, right, all across Turtle Island, and I know that our knowledge keepers tell us that we should say our thanks, and give thanks for being here. And I just wondered, on this National Indigenous Peoples Day, if I could ask you what you're thankful for. Any one of you.
I'll go first. So I was really lucky last year. I mean, it was crazy at the time to move, and I was moving from Vancouver. I was out in Vancouver for a year, but last year I moved back home to the Georgian Bay. So I'm in Penetanguishene Midland area, which is where my family's from, for generations and generations. So I'm really, really, really grateful to be home. I'm super happy. You know, my kids, two of my kids are here with me. My son is in Newfoundland. He's EMTs in an ambulance right now. But my youngest daughter is right now with her dad and my cousins on a fishing trip, on a 3-day fishing trip up by the French River. And the fact that, you know, she can have that she can have access to being on the land and hunting and fishing like I did when I was younger. Man, I'm so thankful for that.
So good to be home. Nice. Yeah. What about you, Waubgeshig? What about in terms of being grateful?
I was just on the res on the weekend in Wasauksing, and I saw a lot of my family, and most people in my circles have had their second shots. They're fully vaccinated. And our son, our younger son, Yabe, was born last June, and he just turned 1 a couple weeks ago. So he hasn't seen a lot of his family yet, but I'm thankful for everyone's health and for everyone getting their vaccinations, that he can have more fulsome summer with his family this year. So I'm hugely thankful for that.
Katherena, what about you? What are you grateful for right now?
I am really, I'm like so many of us coming off of a really emotional month. I'm really just happy for safe, healthy children. I didn't know that, Wob, congratulations. I too had a COVID baby who is now, we're just coming out of our very long isolation, and he's totally overstimulated by faces that aren't ours. So yeah, I hope, yeah, happy, healthy, safe children. I mean, it's so much.
We could do a whole book panel on writing with children, baby children. I don't know how you guys do it. Drew, what about you?
Well, much as everyone here, I've had my 2 shots. My partner's had my 2 shots. I'm really grateful that the 2 of us are healthy and living a good life. And on a personal level, I'm really delighted that I took this negative time, this pandemic, and I've used it for good. I've been very productive, very busy. I've been writing constantly for the last 14, 16 months, and have come out of this pandemic with some really interesting stories that I'm looking forward to seeing where they go.
Drew Hayden Taylor, the author of 732 works of art.
738.
Hardest working Indigenous author out there. We're looking forward to that. Katherena kind of mentioned, so let's turn to the books. And Katherena kind of mentioned it has been a hard month for Indigenous people right across Canada and the United States. The discovery of the graves at the Kamloops residential school has been hard. to say the least. And so I think I want to, our hearts are all going out to the people in the Kamloops and the other residential schools where they're now going through these difficult journeys. But it makes me. You've all touched on some of those difficult aspects of our history. And so I thought maybe if we're going to talk about writing Indigenous identity, maybe we should start there. And Cherie, why don't I throw this out to you? Because your work, The Marrow Thieves, is explicitly about residential schools, and I wonder, is it difficult for you to have to continue to field questions in your author interviews and whenever anyone asks you to come on as an Indigenous author, to have to continually address the historic trauma that our peoples have experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. For sure. It's I wrote the book at a time when there were a few things happening. One of them was that there was this really polite conversation happening across Canadian media where they were like, was it really genocide? Let's take a look at that word genocide and see if does it really actually apply, and let's do a poll. And so there was like a poll in one paper about, asking Canadians, is this really genocide? Is it cultural genocide? And so I was really, quite honestly, just really, really pissed off. I was really angry. And I wanted to write something for the community. It wasn't for anyone else. And I honestly thought it wasn't even going to get published because it was coming from the book, the first draft of the book, I'm no Drew Hayden Taylor, but the first draft of the book was done in 6 weeks because it came from that place of just, like, how can you be having this conversation? These are children. And when I was asked to, and it came from an invitation that came from Theta's Books, and they said they wanted this sort of dystopian story. And I thought, what is the worst possible thing that I could imagine? And the worst possible thing that I can imagine had already happened. And so it was just about moving it into this potential future. And Duncan, like I spoke to hundreds of thousands of kids over the past couple of years because of that book. And I always say, these are places where there were graveyards instead of playgrounds, and that was purposeful. That was part of the architecture. That was the intent. And it's one thing to say it and then sort of have these academic conversations, but now here we are with these graveyards and these babies, and I think about those kids, and I hope that those young people that I spoke to, that if it didn't sink in then, that maybe now. And it's sad that, it maybe now, but maybe now they'll understand what that story is and how it's ongoing. It's not, it is a potential future. It's now, it's the present. So it is difficult, but, here's the great thing is that there's enough Indigenous authors now, and people have sort of gotten off of this whole, like, we just need one Indian for this panel or one Indian for this festival, that we're there together. So, I get to sit with my friends who are here on the panel, people like David Robertson, Louise Haff, and at these events. And so there's a comfort in being there, as a community. So it is a wait, but I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to even begin to introduce an understanding that the decisions we make now will impact the future. We'll stop this from happening again. We'll, hopefully we can move forward in a good way. And the other thing is right, like, I'm just an author. I'm just a writer, and you do the best you can do.
But art, it's part of the function of art to take us into those dark places in the same way that journalism does. Waubgeshig and I have worked in that field to try to take us in dark places. Cherie, you mentioned children and dealing with the residential schools through children. Katherena, you wrote a kid's book about residential schools, Amic Loves School, and I wonder, when you were trying to figure out how to explain that through art to children, what was going through your head?
Wow, I was like, I forgot I wrote that book. It was a few years ago. Those books came from, I had a lovely stint working as an ECE for a lovely organization called Aboriginal Head Start. And in that job, I got to hang out with kids all day and hang out with elders. And it was like, you know, my two favorite kinds of people. And we would talk about teachings. And part of my job was trying to take these really heady teachings like wisdom. Amic Love School is about wisdom. And try to make it palatable for these young kids. And actually, we did a lot of that through story. And Amic Love School was completely inspired by a real life event of a student of mine and their grandparent who came into the classroom. And that grandparent was just amazed to see this classroom with the 7 teachings on the walls and the flags all over the school and this carpet where we all sat in a circle and smudged every morning. And it was one of those moments that everything kind of, you know, comes together and feels really special, because this grandparent was really touched and had previously very negative associations with school. And then they were, like we all are, led by the child into this safe space and shown something new. So I take very little credit for those stories, because I think they were really so inspired by those kids. And that kid's name wasn't Amic, but you know, I just chose that, you know, to kind of tie it all into the whole wisdom thing.
But all
Yeah.
of this showing like such a great demonstration of the intergenerational challenges and a really neat story. Drew, I was joking about being so prolific, but I mean, many people know Drew as the funny man, but you've also tackled this topic. God and the Indian is a play that's pretty challenging. It was about a survivor who meets her abuser. What was it like for you tackling that material in theater?
The origins of that sort of kind of interesting. I had an artistic director who told me, Drew, I know you can be funny. I want you to be serious. So I sat down and I thought about the most serious thing I could write about, which was residential schools. So I sat down and I wrote it, and it was kind of difficult because I had to go places I didn't normally go, though I have touched on the subject in many places. There's a character in Motorcycles and Sweetgrass that is scarred by residential school and those horrid factors. So I often say, like, my mother, we never went to residential school, but we are. It's like a rock being thrown into a pond. Some of us were not thrown into the pond, but we all got splashed. We all got wet by the procedure. So, and we're all having to work our way through the trauma that did originate. And so, yeah, so in doing something like Codgers and Indians, I take myself to a place that was uncomfortable, that was scary, that was unfortunate, that left scars.
And I think the reason I wanted to bring this up is because, of course, it's also recent, and there are survivors who are trying to grapple with this new news and information, even though it's not new to any of the survivors, certainly, but it's triggering for sure. And Wob, I mean, when we think about the role of the artist and bringing, you know, going into those horrors, those dark places. I mean, again, you wrote a dystopic novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, which really kind of touches on some of that apocalypse, right? What's that like for you as an author and an artist?
Well, I think having worked as a journalist for a long time, and you and I had these discussions pretty regularly, despite all those dark issues and stories we were dealing with, I was always inspired whenever I was covering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by the strength of survivors and their will to share their stories so bravely in order to prevent anything like that from ever happening again, right? And I thought, like, if that person who essentially had their childhood and their culture beaten out of them can get up in front of a room full of people on camera and express the intimacies of the horrors they survived for the sake of everybody else, then how amazing is that, and how inspiring is that? And as a journalist, I always felt it was my responsibility to do that properly, and I felt very humbled by the opportunity to be a conduit for those stories. So in fiction, like in journalism, obviously, as you know, there are like time constraints and space limits and so on. But I find in fiction, you can go a little deeper into that context by having sort of being free of limits, essentially, right? You can go deeper into these stories in some ways, you know. And juice.
My apologies.
But yeah, I mean, in a moment like that too, like you could have it be interviewing a survivor and they would bring up something hilarious just to bring you home, you know, just to have to ground you once again. And that's the gift that, you know, these elders keep giving us. And I think that has laid the foundation for so many of us to create these stories that are really born out of love, born out of respect and an admiration for ourselves as Indigenous people who have this bond with the land that has been here since time immemorial before anybody else, right? So it's that, you know, resilience is a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially on a day like today, but it's there for us and we thrive as a result of it.
Yeah, okay. So you throw out resilience. There's another school of thought. I mean, don't call me resilient. Like enough of the resilience already, right? And I wonder, for you guys, is it a balancing act for you to write trauma? I throw that out to anybody.
Nobody wants to answer that one.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have thrown that out to anybody.
Well, I mean, for me, there's my journey as a contemporary storyteller is I like to celebrate the Indigenous sense of humor. It's my personal opinion that it's our sense of humor that's allowed us to survive a lot of these darker moments in our history. So I go out and I celebrate the Indigenous sense of humor, and for me that helps with the healing. I met an elder on the Blood Reserve in Alberta when I was talking to him about this, and he said that in his opinion, for Native people, humor is the WD-40 of healing. And that stayed with me. So I that has been the focus of a larger part of my work. We have trauma. I mean, when oppressed people get their voice back, as we writers, we write about being oppressed. And it's a cathartic thing. It's coming out, it's in our writing, but the next stage of that is the healing process. So what I try and do with my writing is facilitate that healing. This is what's gotten wrong, so let's go about and making it better. So you know, it's two sides of the coin: tragedy and comedy. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Cherie, you wanted to comment on that?
Oh, I totally agree. I was reading Devery Jacobs, who's an incredible actor and filmmaker, had an article in, I think it was Refinery 29 today, and it's called Lolling is Good Medicine, how Indigenous people use humor for survival. And, you know, she talks about, like, it always surprises her when non-Native people don't know just how silly we are. Just how funny we are, how much we embrace that humor, and how, you know, you can be at a funeral and there's laughter. You can be talking about something horrible and there's going to be jokes in there. And it's so much a part of how you hold that trauma in a safe space, because it's buffered by humor. And I always think, like, you know, laughter is the biggest sound you can make, even if it's quiet. Because laughter can go in and clear space for exactly what Drew's talking about, for that healing. It clears the space, it pushes everything else out of the way. It's still there, you can see it, but it's from a different perspective and you can make light of it. It makes it easier to breathe when you laugh first.
Wab was mentioning Katherena, you know, taking care of himself as a journalist and as a writer when going into these difficult topics. What about you? I mean, when I think of the break, and trying to deal with sexual abuse and extreme sexual abuse, that must have taken a toll on you as a writer. What's that process for you of taking care of yourself when you're dealing with these tough issues?
I actually learned it from after writing that book, because I wrote that book and then I made a film right around that time that was about murdered and missing Indigenous women, Indigenous persons. So it was kind of like this two really heavy things all at the same time. And I didn't take time to take care of myself. I was in that writer mode that we're in all the time, right? Where we just think we have to go all the time. And I absolutely fell down after the break came out. There was months where it was like it was COVID back in 2016. I was in sweatpants. I didn't go outside because I didn't take the time to take care of myself. And I learned the hard way how important that is. How when you write about heavy things, you have to give yourself buffers all around you. You know, I can't write anymore, and I don't write anymore after about noon or so, because I tend to write about trauma, and I tend to kind of dive into things. So I like to give myself lots of space to come out of that. You know, I save the dog walk for the end of the day. I save, so I can come back. So by the time I pick up my kids, you know, I'm back in kind of fighting form. I also really, and something that carries me every day when because I do think that, and as artists, we kind of go through our own stuff as we, you know, I always say the secret is the writers, we're all just talking about our own stuff over and over again. But part of what I think we do as we talk about our stuff is we heal ourselves at the same time. You know, we're finding a way through. We're just like, you know, battling through the bush, trying to get back to the clearing or whatever. And I really think of something a very dear friend told me years ago, and she's a knowledge keeper and a traditional storyteller, and her name is Kona Saber. I have to give a shout out to her as I'm quoting her. And she said, you know, part of our role as storytellers is we have to find a way through. We can't just leave people in the middle of the trauma. We can't just leave them in the dark place, you know, stuck in Mirkwood with the big hairy spiders. We have to bring them through to the sunny place. So I think of that every day, and every day at some point, as much as we might have to get into the murkiness, I like to make sure I'm getting into the sunshine a little bit too, because there is that balance. You can't have one without the other. Well, hopefully you can have the sunshine without the murky spiders, but you have to make sure to get through to something, if only to save yourself, you know.
I want to get into some murkiness, and I hope you guys don't get whiplash for me taking you. I'm going to switch topics somewhat generally, but we're talking about drama, and there's also in the news the past couple of months, that there's been something that's been very important to the Indigenous creative industry, and that is we're talking about identity and writing Indigenous identity. There have been a number of concerns raised about people who claim to be Indigenous, about false claims to indigeneity. And I didn't want to leave this discussion about writing Indigenous identity without kind of getting your thoughts on that topic. So I wonder, maybe if I could start with you, Wab, if you have any thoughts on how the literary industry should deal or can deal with some of the revelations of authors who are claiming Indigenous identity, who are perhaps, whose identity is now in question.
Well, you know, I don't have any solutions as to, manning the gate, so to speak, as to who gets in and who gets to tell the stories or not. But it really, in my opinion, in my experience, it does come back to the trauma and what you have witnessed and what you have survived, right? And I believe that confronting that trauma and addressing it is important to those of us who have endured it in different ways, to understand that we as Indigenous people are not responsible for that. We're not responsible for what has happened to us, right? And part of that results in pushing back against what the mainstream defines us as, which is our traumas. And that's a result of a futile education system, schools that didn't teach Canadians about the proper history of this land, and Indigenous kids who would go through that system and not see themselves reflected in any sort of positive way. And then the mainstream media, which only fortified those stereotypes and those tropes, right? So for us, for those of us who only see that perspective of us, trauma sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, right? We just assume that that is our destiny as tragic people. So I believe like, and you don't want to put like, you know, a checklist of what you have survived as an Indigenous person to make you an authentic Indigenous voice, right? But there are things I believe that, you know, when I see people sort of latch on to identity for their own benefit, it really irritates me to know that they maybe have not endured the suicides of their relatives or those ongoing funerals, or, you know, that the early deaths of people in their family because of health outcomes in our communities, right? So I don't have a solution, as I mentioned, but you know, that is what really irks me about the general situation. So I'll pass it on.
Cherie, Pretendians, what should the book world do about them?
Oh, I have one potential solution. I think we need to have Indigenous people in power in publishing. I think there wouldn't be so many mistakes being made if the decision makers were from the community. I think having an all white or non-Indigenous board, having, you know, all staff and editors and, you know, everyone involved in the holding of Indigenous narratives, you know, it doesn't work, because then mistakes are made, and then we end up being called upon to do the work of walking it back, or you know, correcting course or whatever it is. But if you have Indigenous people in positions of power, real positions of power, I don't mean being called in to consult, being, you know, called when there's an issue, honestly sitting at the table and talking about the ways in which we know each other, the ways in which our stories need to be held and carried forward, that's where real change is affected, right? That's where the impacts are. Because I think, you know, there's three, just, you know, it comes to mind, there's three real main things that happen when, you know, we have people who sort of latch onto an identity and run forward with it. One, it divides, right? And it brings negativity and suspicion into the actual community, which then two, slows down the work that we have to do. There's so much work to be done. And then three, it puts potential trauma and hesitation on those who are genuinely trying to return home. People, you know, who went to the schools, who were adopted out. I mean, if you are leaving trauma and horror and you are running towards home, and someone comes and tells you, hey, there's a mob in front of the house and they're looking for anyone trying to get in, you might slow down. You might slow down because you don't want any extra trauma. You don't want to be attacked on your way home. So I think about those people and what the impacts are. You know, and I just think if we have people like I've had a lot of meetings and you know, calls with people since this, you know, the latest sort of Pretendian thing broke, where we said, okay, you know, let's use, again, Devery Jacobs put out this great response to the Latimer scandal, saying let's introduce ourselves in the way that we do. You know, let's talk about family. Let's talk about community and land and who we belong to. And we've done that, just like straightforward, like, this is my mare, this is where I'm from, here's where my family hunts. You know, and the great thing about, you know, one of the blessings of being Indigenous is that most of the time, someone knows someone in your family. And then you have another connection to build that business and relationship on. So I think what we need to do is recenter Indigenous worldview and processes into the creative industry. Because, you know, the ways that people are getting in is not through us. So perhaps we need to be in positions where we can make things happen.
And just because I can feel the Giller lawyers right now sitting there writing letters to themselves back and forth. For the record, Michelle Latimer has said that she is connected to an Indigenous community after some inquiries by the media into her identity. Drew, I wonder, I mean, should the panels be policing Indigenous identity? Should the awards, the publishers, should they be policing Indigenous identity?
Ironically, I have an article out in the Globe today about Indianism and whatever. Should they be patrolling the ramparts of publishing? It's I think the very fact that we ourselves do not, well, a lot of us have different views on how this should be attached. One of the interesting ways I've heard people discuss on who is Native, who is not, is, you know, the 3 rule: somebody who self-identifies, somebody who the community recognizes, and third can trace their family back to a specific location. You know, that's one type of answer. Another one is the whole thing about, like, my grandfather here on the reserve, his grandmother, I think, was Irish. So that's like 4 or 5 generations back. I was never good at that kind of math. So evidently on my grandfather's side, I have some Irish blood, but under no way would I consider myself Irish. I don't claim it. It's interesting, it's there. So it's also this whole thing of having ancestry, but being shaped by a living, breathing culture around you, right? I'm sitting here in my mother's house and on my reserve. This is who I am, this is where I came from, and this is what makes me who I am. So I feel comfortable when I say I'm Native. I've had, my article today is basically about people who are talk about white passing Native people, how that whole concept of privilege and stuff like that. And it's like, I grew up here. This is completely my environment and my world. So I think those are things to take into consideration. There was somebody recently who wanted to create some sort of act that would regulate, I think it was the Indigenous Authenticity Act or something, wanted to push that through Parliament as a way of justifying who can say they're Native and who can say they're not. And I was sort of thinking about that, and I suddenly realized, isn't there already a big act going in Parliament that decides who's Native and who's not Native? It's called the Indian Act. So I don't know how viable all of that is.
And Katherena, before I let this one go, I'll throw it out to you, because I mean, this is a challenging question for all Métis in terms of defining identity and who is Métis and who is not. But I wonder in the creative sector, you know, whether it's books, whether it's film, are there special challenges for trying to parse out, or I mean, there's so many of, we have these conversations, you know, after about, I'll say that it's the anti-network or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we share these stories, but should these stories be becoming public in terms of identity and calling out people who we don't necessarily think are connected to community?
That feels hard to me, because I don't know. I think there's a certain, you know, definitely there's a role that calling out plays. I think there's also a role that calling in plays. I think that when we have these conversations, like Cherie said, I like to always preface this with the idea of there are many people who are reclaiming. There are many people who have lost who don't know where they are from. And I'm thinking of the kids in my province, so many kids coming out of the foster care system that have no connection to community. And that is absolutely tragic. And so many people who, especially in Métis, in the Métis community, it's everywhere, where people were, things were either hidden, or things were, or they were people that were passed for a generation or two, and they have connections to their community that they're afraid to come out now. They're afraid to be Métis. They're afraid to say that they're Métis, because there's so many different definitions out there of Métis, and we're all confused. And I understand that, and capital M and small m and all of that. And I think all of that needs to be cleared up. And I think it does always come down to nations. Nations build their membership, and it comes down to communities, and communities claim each other. And, you know, if you claim a community and community claims you, then that's belonging. That's where belonging comes from. So, I mean, it's hard to say as far as what calling out will do, because I think for me, I think you know, different people might have different ideas about what that might mean. I do think that what tires me of this conversation is that so often the labor is put onto us. And there's so much that we have to do. And I'm thinking of sitting on panels and being in decision-making chairs and being on juries and looking through these applications and you know, that's extra work for us. And I don't think we need any extra work because we have a lot of work that we're already manning. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's my answer. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's
to be continued. I mean, this is a discussion
Exactly.
that isn't going away, and we'll probably get more intense for sure. I want to remind everybody that's watching that you're welcome to send in your questions on the Q&A, and I'm going to turn to those in about 5 minutes or so. But I got about 5 minutes left where I can put questions at these folks. So it is National Indigenous Peoples Day, or NAFNIP Day, as Drew calls it, Native Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous people. It being a day of celebration, last year it felt very muted because we were in the middle of COVID, and this year it feels a little less muted, but again heavy. I mean, there's a lot of heaviness going on this day. So I just wonder if you could tell me, you know, as you're on your journey as authors and looking for hope, what gives you hope, and what are you leaning into in terms of hope when you're in your writing? And Cherie, maybe if I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Go to the person who writes dystopian for hope.
Well, you know,
okay.
I'm giving you the chance here. Come on, lighten up.
No, you know what? Actually, so after the Marrow Thieves, I wrote a book called Empire of Wild, and it is essentially, you know, this sexy bisexual Rougarou creature who, and it's, you know, it's a love story, and it's like brings in like old German magic, and it was so fun to write, and it's based on stories that I heard when I was young. In my community, one of the stories about how the half-breeds, First Nations, and the French communities, because we all lived separately, sort of came together was over this giant, strange wolf that was haunting the road and was hunting people, but would stop and play with children. It's called La Loupe de La Fontaine. So we have a lot of wolf stories here and a lot of Rougarou stories, like, you know, out in the West in Métis communities and down in Louisiana with the Creole people. So that was one of the ways that that was actually part of my self-care from writing sort of this, you know, the world of the Marrow Thieves. But that it reminded me of what I really needed. And so I was feeling really homesick, and it wasn't just about physically coming home. It was just about, I'd been out, you know, for so long, and you sort of do the circuit and you do the, you know, you're talking and you get involved in all kinds of conversations. And, you know, I did a lot with from the Canada Reads event with Omar El-Akkad, and who wrote American War. And we would say, like, man, imagine how cool it would be to be a white writer. Like, people ask you about plot and character development, and they're asking him about like the Taliban and like what's happening in the Middle East, and they're asking me about pipelines and residential school, and we're just exhausted after, right? So I really wanted to come home. And so writing Empire of Wild, which is based on old stories that my mare and her sisters told me, made me feel light and wonderful. And of course, the book still talks about colonization and resource extraction, but it's funny, right? And it's sexy. And that's what gives me hope, that I am lucky enough to come from a community to have that, like Katherena said, that belonging back and forth, both ways, the claiming and being claimed, that I come from a place of story, this deeply spooky, crazy little community on the Georgian Bay. And that's what keeps me sort of buoyant, that it is always there. And it is, you know, yes, I get to, you know, tell these stories and go out, but they're waiting for me. They're always at home whenever I sort of wander back.
I'll go to the other dystopic author for this question about hope as well. You're writing, or in draft form, for the sequel to Moon and the Crusted Snow, Waubgeshig. Do they get their power back? I mean, please, I hope so. What about you? How do you find hope?
Yeah, they plug their cell phones in and voila. Well, I find hope in those renewal stories, and that's what inspired me to write a dystopian / post-apocalyptic story in the first place. Because, you know, growing up, my grandmother told me about how her generation had to pick up the pieces after their world ended, right? And that's why we have a lot of the things we have today as it relates to our culture, like you know, our stories and our language and so on. But what gives me the most hope is the young people who are working hard to bring their language back. I think that's the most important work happening right now out there in Indian country. And, you know, the irony is we're all talking about our work here, but, you know, we have devoted most of our time to the English language, right? A colonizer's language. But there are young people in communities where I'm from who are raising their kids fluently with the Anishinaabe, you know, and that is the ultimate sort of resistance against colonization and sort of the ultimate reclamation in my belief anyway. So that's those young people inspire me. I aspire to be like them eventually. I want to raise my kids to be fluent speakers eventually too, you know? So that's where, yeah, I derive a lot of my hope.
And a shout out to Wobb's brother, who is one of those young people who is doing that amazing language reclamation work, and so important and such a hard journey. Drew, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, for you, writing humor, writing funny, being funny is part of that hopeful aspect. What keeps you looking for the humor in everything?
Oh, I have been to about 150 First Nation communities in Canada and the United States. And everywhere I've been greeted with a laugh, a smile, and a joke. And yet in the dominant culture, there's so much of a belief of the stoic Indian, the tragic Indian, all that sort of stuff. And I was having trouble putting the two together. So I find hope in laughter. What you were talking about, I think it was Cherie who was talking about, you know, even at funerals, there's humor. If I may share a brief story, when my mother passed away, we went to the funeral home and we're talking with the guy who runs it, and there was me, my partner, 2 aunts, and three cousins, all women, and we're sitting up there and we're planning my mother's funeral. A very, very sad thing, but we're all sitting there trying to figure out what my mother would want, and we couldn't stop laughing because we'd say, we want these flowers. No, my mother would hate that. What are we going to bury her in? And it was just got more and more ridiculous. And we were just laughing so much at the memory of my mother and what she would want, what she'd feel all embarrassed about, the attention, about all of that. And this was upstairs at the funeral home, and there was a wake happening downstairs. And at the end of it, when we finally figured out everything that was going to happen and the meeting was open, we stood up to say goodbye, and I reached over, and the guy who runs the funeral home reached over to shake my hand. I reached over to shake his hand, and he leaned over and he said to me, "I don't get to say this very often, but that was fun." So to me, that's what gives me hope. That's what gives me strength to know that even in the face of one of the most important people in my life, we could still laugh about her memory. She was there in the room, and we were concerned about what she would think about this whole thing that was happening. And we walked out of there smiling.
Katherena, you very generously shared earlier how tough it was for you writing The Break and going into that dark place and the toll that it took on you. And thank you, Miigwech, for that. That was very generous of you to share that. I wonder if you can reflect on hope and what gives you hope as you're on the writing journey.
Every time I sit down and write, I make up characters that are kind of based on who I love and the people that surround me, and they give me hope. You know, whenever I look for answers of the whys and the hows and the what are we going to do, it's always from those warrior aunties and those uncles and those kids. I mean, oh, it's all in the kids. Kids are freaking brilliant. And well, we have to say that because I have little ones at home, so I have to pretend that kids are going to save the future. So I wake up and take care of them. But they really are. They're freaking brilliant. I have 2 really young kids and two older ones who are young adults now, and they are eons ahead of where I was when I was their age. And that gives me all the hope I need, that they are doing what they're supposed to do and going further than I went, and just like I went further than my parents went. So that gives me hope. It also lets me rest because they have more energy and they can do all the work.
I promised our audience here that we would get to their questions. So the last 10 minutes here, I'm going to turn it over to them. So I've got all the Q&A here in the Zoom thing, and I'm just going to try to scream through as fast as I can. Yolanda won a comic, just had a comment. Raisin and cinnamon in my bannock all the way. My grandmother Josephine won a comic, was well known for her raisin bannock. So there you go, Cherie. You got another raisin bannock lover out there. Here's a good question. Paul Hangle has one good question for National Indigenous Peoples Day. Can you recommend a lesser known author, Indigenous author, I assume he's referring to, for young adults to read? So are there any of your faves on your bookside tables right now that you would recommend that people may not know?
I always go to David Robertson, who writes 5 books a year, but I don't know how he could possibly be better known. So yeah, I don't know, young adult.
David Robertson from Manitoba, and especially for people who are looking into residential schools, and David has written and has explored this in many different ways. So absolutely a good recommendation. Anybody else have any favorites, Indigenous authors that they would recommend right now?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, well, okay, just quickly, Angeline Boulay she's from Sault Ste. Marie. She just wrote Firekeeper's Daughter, which, so it's I mean, if you don't know, it's about to be a Netflix show through the Obama's film company, Higher Ground. So I read it and interviewed her, and she's hilarious and a lot of good fun. There's like measy jokes in there. It's
Anybody else? Wob, you had one?
Well, I was just going to give a shout out to Nathan Adler, Anishinaabe author. I would say, yeah, it could, he writes horror mostly, but young adults could dig it, I think. Okay.
Anybody else have any suggestions?
I read one, oh God, about 2 months ago. I was asked to blurb it, and it was quite good. It's about growing up in the 50s and 60s in an Okanagan reserve, and I blurbed it, but I've gone through so many books since then, I cannot remember the title or the author.
Okay, the name will come to you. I'm sure you're suffering from Alzheimer's there, but we'll bring you back for that name. Okay, Leslie Harris has a question here. So how can we preserve the language and learn about cultural identity through language? So Wob, I'll start you on that one, just because you raised the importance of Anishinaabe and tell us what your thoughts are for Leslie.
Yeah, I think the onus is totally on governments to fully fund immersion programs for everybody who wants them, because the federal government is responsible for destroying Indigenous languages, so it must fully restore them. Too often the onus is upon the individual to try to learn on their own. And as a 42-year-old person myself, like, I have to pay to take courses, right? And I can afford that, that's fine with me, but not everybody has that privilege, you know? So Indigenous people of all ages and non-Indigenous people alike should have full opportunities to learn languages fluently, and it should be fully funded by governments. That's just my opinion.
I see you nodding about language. Do you want to say anything about language?
Is it me again?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm very excited about this whole panel. I'm very animated. So I think there's a few things. One, I try and include little bits of language in my own work. The dialect that my mare and my pair, both my grandparents, spoke is like this. It's this mix of really old French and Anishinaabe from around here. And the last fluent speaker that I knew of in the community passed away some years ago. But when I include, I have Anishinaabe characters, I include Anishinaabe, and then I reach out to, people like Waubgeshig, who's been completely instrumental in so much of my work in making sure that, perspective is right, and the language is, that I'm not that I'm not speaking where I shouldn't speak, that I'm trying to create a space where, you know, this is the land we're on, these people are here, we need to ensure that there's language, and that it's not italicized, it's not othered, it is central to the story. The Marrow Thieves, the sequel will be out this fall. It's called Hunting by Stars. And Waubgeshig and Waubgeshig worked on the Anishinaabe in that book. So I'm really, really grateful to have, you know, friends and family that can help me create that space. And that's small, right? And then I think I absolutely agree. It needs to be, you know, on government, absolutely, because that's where the destruction began. But, you know, personally, like I've gotten to a point in my career where I'm able to, so 25% of all the royalties in perpetuity from Hunting by Stars is going to go to programs run by Indigenous teachers and knowledge holders and professionals to provide supports to children and elders for language and well-being, because I don't think anyone should have to start life or end life without culture, because that's so important. So, you know, I'm able to do small things like that, and that's nothing, right? That's a drop in the bucket. But I think, you know, every small effort, right? It's like doing beadwork. It looks so daunting. You're like, this is never going to get done, but eventually, I mean, there's a whole constellation, right?
There's your metaphor for the panel.
Nishin. Here's a question that I hesitate to ask you guys this, but there's a bunch of people that are asking it. So there's a couple different versions. Leslie Harris, what can non-Indigenous individuals do to help? And then Louise Kilby has a same version of it, or similar version. What do you see as the role of those who are now being called settlers in reconciliation? We've only got a couple minutes left. Drew, do you want to tackle that one?
Oh God, that's the question. If I had the answer to that, I'd be a much happier person. I think it's a matter of understanding, of paying attention. That whole like cliche of having 2 ears but only 1 mouth. So listen, understand before you kind of rush in and say, "I want to help. I want to help. I want to help." You know, context is everything. So I would suggest people who want to what's the term, ally themselves, be allies, to sort of come in and have a full understanding of what they're walking into. This is going to sound really odd. It's not simple being Indigenous. And if you want to be an ally, you have to understand the complexities of everything we have to deal with.
Katherena, what about the allies? What should they do to help? Or can they help?
It's not a big question at all. I agree. Listen is always providing space. Whenever the pretendian thing comes up, my biggest thing is always they're taking up space. Let's acknowledge where we all need to be. Space, listening, those sound good. What else can allies do? I think one of my pet peeves is always, when you asking questions is great, but ask the question. You know, sometimes I love to give space for education, but sometimes I'm in the grocery store with my 2-year-old and I can't, something like that. Like if, we all wear these hats and we all try to be our best selves, but sometimes we need a little bit of warning before we ask all the questions. There's so many resources out there. Go look at the books, go do the research, do simple Google searches on things. I mean, there's a wealth of information. There is tons and tons of elders and lesser known artisans and artists and writers in your community that, can come into, want to come into classrooms and want to, to teach these things and to share these knowledges. And whenever possible, when that happens, pay fairly and pay on the spot. None of this 8 weeks waiting for a check that comes in the mail bullshit. Always pay fairly and always make sure. It doesn't work. I mean, so much. Anyway, then I'm done.
I have an elder who I'm very fond of who says, Miigwech, thank you for the sema and the tobacco, but sema doesn't run my Ford F-150 either. So
exactly.
Yeah. So I got about 2 minutes left, and I'm sorry. Thank you to everyone who gave us questions. There's too many here for me to get to. I'm sorry, but there's so many great questions, and I urge you to reach out. As Katherena said, there's a wealth of information on Google that you can find out some of the answers to your questions. But a last question I'll lob out here. Christine Vanderwall says, what would be your biggest piece of advice to settler teachers in teaching truth in their classrooms? Thinking about Murray Sinclair, education got us into this, education will get us out. And I think, I know there are a lot of book readers and book clubs and teachers who are watching us right now. I just wonder if we could close off on that helpful note. Is there anything that you'd recommend for teachers in the classrooms? Wab, why don't we go to you?
I would say when we're allowed to, get real people into your classroom to visit with the kids, whether they're elders or some kind of other knowledge keepers, and make sure you pay them. Reading is great. Consulting Google or online resources is great too. All that information is out there. But in terms of building relationships, like bringing people in and enlightening the kids is really, I think, the best way to go about it. And it's easy. I think, I do a lot of work with school boards, and almost every board has like their FNMI position, right? And those people are very resourceful, and they know of the elders and the various knowledge keepers in the communities around the cities or the towns or whatever else, right? So yeah, fostering those real life in-person relationships.
As I wrap up here, I just want to urge our audience. We're joking a little bit and laughing about honorariums and paying people, but during the pandemic, I want to make a plea to everybody that's watching. It is the artists that have got us through. We have turned to music, we have turned to authors, we have turned to filmmakers to try to get us through the difficult days of the pandemic, and they need to make a living too. Okay, there is a notion that has been unleashed by the internet about free content. I am urging everybody in the audience to go out and buy a book, to go out to your public library, because they also support Cherie and Katherena and Waubgeshig and Drew in their endeavors, and it is not easy. These are 4 famous authors, but I can tell you right now that it is not easy putting food on the table and supporting yourself as you're trying to create your art. So I'm going to end on that note. I thank you so much to the Giller Prize for inviting all of these illustrious authors, and I'm so honored and privileged to share the stage with them. Their words give us joy and thought, and really your work, all 4 of you, miigwech, you really do make this country a better place, and so I thank you for that. And I do want to, all of your audience who has joined us, thank you so much for joining us tonight. But a reminder, go out and support your authors. Go out and support your local bookstore. Go out to the public library and support, and because the authors need to feed their children as well. And it's a good reminder that stories need to be supported. So, miigwech, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and bamapi. Hope to see you on the internets.
Miigwech, bamapi.
Bye-bye, miigwech.
Bye.
I can't thank you enough, everybody. Thank you, Duncan, Cherie, Drew, Katherena, and Wab, for lending us your time and your talent tonight. I second what Duncan said in support of all the authors through whatever means you can. What an absolutely fantastic conversation, exchange of ideas. For anybody who's missed this event, the video will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the coming days, especially you educators, if you want to share it with classrooms in the fall. And I hope to see you all back here on July 12th, when we feature some of Canada's most important LGBTQ2S+ writers. Thank you again so much for joining us.